All right, again, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. Today, we are going to be continuing review of CDFM Module 1, Competency 2. Last week, we did Competency 1. And before I begin, I typically like to do a review. So let me pull up the schedule. So before we do the review, let me see. I want to show. Does everyone have a copy of this schedule? So if you go into Teams and you look in the file section, you'll see the different files. And I put the 2023 schedule there, because if you look at the schedule, it tells you when or how much each section is worth. So I'm trying to see if I can share it with you. Let's see if I can do that. If not, we'll go ahead and continue. Let me see. CDFM calendar. So y'all let me know if you can see the CDFM calendar, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what I want to point out with the calendar, if you look to the far right, so last week we did Competency 1. If you notice, it's worth, let me move this little box out the way so I can see. Competency 1 is worth 30.4% of the exam. The section we're doing today is only 12%. Next week, Module 1, Competency 3 is worth 20.3%, and Fiscal Law accounts for 37.1%. The reason you need to know the percentage or the weight of this section is because on the exams, it's not going to tell you which section you're in. That's for one. And you also will know how to focus your study time. So if you can see that Fiscal Law and Competency 1.1 accounts for the majority of the question, most of your time should be spent to understanding those sections. Does everyone understand that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I think that was a yes. All right. So I wanted to make sure you understand what the percentages are. It doesn't say that, okay, you got 2 questions from Module 2, Competency 2, 1 question. It doesn't tell you that. You have to know just the information. And if you also notice, I do not go over the knowledge check. Not that I don't recommend you doing it, is that the knowledge check is going to help you to make sure you know key terms. However, again, it's comprehension of the entire information is what you're trying to accomplish. So that's what I wanted. Go ahead. I have a question.
Go down.
Oh, okay. Somebody has a hot mic or feedback. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And let's see. All right. So everyone can see my video, correct? Make sure I'm back. The only bad thing, I don't have that feedback. All right. So before we begin with 1.2, you always want to, when you're studying, you want to recap the old information. Even after we go over Competency 2 today, you want to go over the information again, because you need to be able to visualize how it all ties together. So if y'all don't have any questions for me, I'm going to ask you several questions. Anybody can answer. All right, so we say that the Constitution provides general guidelines in how we should operate as a country. In the Constitution, because it has separation of powers, they developed 3 branches of government. Who can tell me what are the 3 branches of government? I'll start it off easy for you. Go ahead, Ms. Tina.
Good morning, Ms. Helen. Good morning, everyone. It is the legislative, the executive, and the judicial.
Correct. And in the correct order. So not just it is in the correct order. So under the Constitution, there's powers that's invested in the Congress, the executive branch, and judicial branch. Where can I find information for the executive branch in the Constitution? In the Constitution, where can I find information for the executive branch?
I believe
right.
it's in Article 2 of the Constitution.
Yes. that's
Article
what I was
2,
gonna- yeah,
that's
Article 2.
correct. If you learn legislative, executive, judicial, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, and then you zoom in, okay, well, what does Article 1 cover? Because Article 1 governs what the legislative branch, Congress, the ones who make the laws, what they're allowed to do. How many years does the House of Representative personnel serve in a term?
2 years,
2
Two.
years. Senators,
6 years.
6.
6 years. All right, based on the Constitution, it also says that the president must return the bill within how many days?
10 days.
10 days, right? Before things start happening. And then Congress has the power to collect taxes. What is the reason why the government shuts down? Why does the government shut down if we don't have a new appropriation law by 1 October? Who wants to take that? Miss Tina, I see you thinking about it.
Yeah,
Why does the government shut down? We've been living it, so why does the government shut down if we don't have an appropriation law on 1 October? Gotta be a reason. So, which is the article I told you, or section, that if nothing else as a financial manager, you should know it? Which one?
See Article 1, Section 9.
9.
There you go, Mr. Allen.
Ah,
Article 1,
okay.
Section 9. If you don't remember none of them, you better remember that one, right? Because it trickles. Based on the Constitution, it says no money can come out of the Treasury unless you have an appropriation law in place. So whether that is a actual appropriation law, or what's the name of the temporary appropriation law that we go under most years, we fall under?
CR.
The CR, continuing resolution. So the legislative makes the laws, the executive executes the laws, and what's the function of the judicial branch?
I'm sorry, the question again, please,
What is the function of the judicial branch?
is to interpret the law.
They interpret the law. That is correct. Or the Supreme Court or the inferior court. So we have laws, and then we need somebody to interpret that those laws are lawful or constitutional. So they interpret the laws. Who can introduce a bill, joint resolution? Who can introduce any one of those documents? Just flipping through, reviewing. Who can introduce a bill? Can you just walk in and introduce a bill?
No, it has to be done by the committees.
So it's either by committee or there's 3 different ways. So you've got committee.
Oh, the
Committee
president
by
can
the
do it.
president
President and by the members.
and
of the House
members.
of
So the
Rep- yeah.
president is done typically during what time of the year? What is he doing at that time?
State of the Union address.
The State of the Union address. So typically doing the State of the Union address. So going back to those knowledge check question, if you look in the beginning, I think like the last question, whenever you see Article 1, automatically your brain should say, okay, that's Congress, because I think it asks which branch of government can, under Article 1, can collect taxes. So if you know Article 1 is legislative, you already know the answer to it. So you're looking for keywords. So that's why I'm just pointing you out. All right, so the bill process, formulation process. So when the bill is first introduced, it's entered into what is the term used when the bill is first introduced?
The hopper.
Into the hopper. And then the committee do their markup. Again, the hopper is no different than you turning in your award that you're submitting for someone or evaluation. You put it in the hopper, then someone else looks at it, they write it up, mark it up, they ask you questions. What does this mean? So after the hopper, it goes to the markup period. Then it goes back to the originator. Once the originator corrects that document, what is the document called in the bill process?
Is it clean bill?
A clean bill. So they've cleaned it up. They take all the marks out, make all the corrections on the document. It's called a clean bill. Then the House and the Senate individually are going to look at that bill, that recommendation. When it's passed either the House or the Senate, what is it called?
An engrossed bill.
Engrossed bill. And then the House and the Senate has to come together because only one bill can go forward to the president for the president to sign. What is it called when the House and the Senate comes together? And what are they doing?
Is
What
the
is the
third
purpose?
chamber
The
or
third
resolving
chamber,
or
okay.
resolving difference?
They're resolving their differences. So it's also called a conference committee. So anytime you hear conference committee, whichever process you're in, whether it's the budget side or regular bill, conference committee is telling you that the House and the Senate is coming together to resolve differences. It doesn't matter how many members they bring to the third chamber, is they're voting as one House and they're voting as one Senate, and then together they have to decide what is the way ahead. All right, so the president, once he receives the bill, I think we asked this already, but if we didn't catch it before, by law, the president has how long to respond to that bill?
10 days.
10 days
10
while
days, right?
Congress is in session.
Okay, so he either approves it within that 10 days, signs it, approve it, it becomes law, or he does not sign it and it still becomes law if he doesn't sign it within 10 days. And as Ms. Tina says, as long as Congress is in session, the president receives the bill, he doesn't sign it within 10 days, that bill automatically becomes law. You might say, why would he let that happen? It might be something small and he or she does not have time or the energy to fight it, so they don't have a problem with it. So they go ahead and allow it to become law on its own. They're not going to take the time to review it. What is the difference between a pocket veto and a regular veto? I got a veto in my pocket or just a regular veto?
The pocket veto is when the Congress adjourn and the president fails to sign the bill within the 10
Okay.
days, and the veto is when the president actually is not in favor of the bill, and I believe they returns it back without approval.
Okay, so pocket veto, the president received the bill, does not do anything within 10 days, but it does not become law because Congress is adjourned. Congress is not in session. Pocket veto. Regular veto, he does not agree with the bill, so he returns the bill. Now, a bill is typically thousands of pages. So if he doesn't agree with just one sentence, can he just mark that section out, that sentence, sign it, and allow it to become law?
No,
Why not?
because that's part of the Line Item Veto Act of 1996 when President Clinton was in office, and he had attempted to do this, but Congress disagreed with his actions.
Okay, okay, that is correct. So I'm sure he got away with, it's not, it wasn't here. It was all the way up until he became president.
Yeah, you're right about that.
So think about the presidents before him, they were all doing it. It was
Yes.
just until President Clinton came on board and somebody challenged it. And then the court said, no, it's unconstitutional. You cannot take that 1,000-page document, line out or mark out what you don't like, and then sign it to become law. You have to send the entire document back. So that's what occurs. All right. What is the name of the budget office for Congress? What is the name
OBM, the OBM.
for Congress?
It's the
Oh no, that's for
OMB.
the president.
Okay, any takers? Think about it. Remember
Is
that
it
you have
the
to know your hierarchy. Go ahead, Mr. Allen.
No.
congressional budget?
Congressional Budget Office. So remember, Congress, President, Congress has Congressional Budget Office, executive branch, or the president has, what's the name of their budget office for the president?
That's the OMB.
That's the Office of Management and Budget. That's correct. So you got to be able to separate them. And if you go on down to the Department of Defense, what is the title of the budget person at the Department of Defense, since this is a defense exam?
Is it the
That's-
USD comptroller?
That's your USD comptroller. Make sure you can break those pieces. If I throw them all in one pot, you make sure you know which one goes to Congress, the executive, or the Department of Defense. So OMB, CBO, OMB, and you have another key player is the GAO. What does GAO stand for?
Government Accountability Office.
The Government Accountability Office. And of the different sections, who do they work for? So the GAO works for, what do they do there? Think about the function of the GAO. And if you've been any place where the GAO is coming to, I mean, people lose their mind. Why? What is the function of the Government Accountability Office?
They work directly with the Congress.
Okay.
I believe they monitor the executive branch.
Okay, that is exactly what they do. They're an external auditing agency that works directly for Congress. Congress lays out the plan for the budget, the do's, the don'ts, and then the GAO is the one that monitors the executive branch. Because the executive branch is the one that submits the budget, right? They get the budget, the president's budget. So that's why GAO is evaluating them. When is the president required to submit the budget to Congress each year for that fiscal year?
It's by February, the first Monday in February. of the
No
calendar.
later. Make
No
sure
later
you understand.
than, yes,
There you go.
yes,
No later
than
than the first Monday
February.
in February. That's correct.
Of the calendar year. Well, of course, it's the calendar year, but yes, okay.
Yes, ma'am. So, and we operate on the fiscal year. So you got to remember 1 October of one year to 30 September of the other year. That's how we operate. All right. So the president submits the budget to Congress, then Congress goes through the budget resolution process, the authorization process, and the appropriation process. What is the function of the budget resolution process? Why? Why are they doing that? Or what are they doing? What is Congress doing? So think through that process. Budget resolution. The president gives them the budget and then they have meetings about it, the budget. So what are they doing? They being Congress.
they review it.
But even before they actually review it, what do they have to do in the budget resolution process? And think of the
They get
size,
together. They get together, the House and the Senate.
right? Because think about it, you got the size of the House, you got the size of the Senate. They have to then decide what guidelines they're going to follow when they look at the president's budget. So if you look through that section with budget resolution, they're trying to come up with the guidelines, basically, of what they're going to look for when they get the budget from the president. What are they going to evaluate it based on? The deficit, the guidelines they gave from last year. So that's part of the function of the Congressional Budget Office to gather that historical data so that Congress can then decide, okay, this is what they're going to look at. So which House and which Senate is responsible for the budget resolution process? Ms. Tina, I see your hand up. Is that a question?
Yeah, I have a question, but go ahead and finish this one up first.
Okay, which House and which Senate is responsible for the budget resolution process?
The House,
Go ahead.
the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee.
Right, so that one's it's easy. The word budget is in their name. House budget and Senate budget. What about the authorization process? Which House and which Senate?
The House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee.
And the appropriators? Who are the appropriators?
The House Appropriation Committee, I'm sorry, House Appropriations Committee, yeah, and the Senate Appropriation Committees.
Okay, I just wanted to finish that series. Okay, you go ahead and ask your question, Ms. Tina, before you forget.
Okay, going back to when you had mentioned that, and I'm just reading this verbatim from the book, Congressional Budget Office provides support to various committees by its scorekeeping responsibilities. Does that go back to in alignment when you said that where Congress comes to pretty much come together to look at which legislation is going to be up for consideration that year, or is it always the same legislation that they want to get passed?
Well,
I
it
hope that
depends.
makes sense.
It depends on the focus for that year. So
Okay.
what the Congressional Budget Office is, think of an accountant. Their job is to gather, once they do the day-to-day operations, and then they provide the historical data. So it talks about the budget authority that they had, outlays, how much we've spent, any surplus, deficit. So you're gathering all the, I guess you could say, financial data for the federal budget is gathered. Scorekeeping is just keeping track of the changes, the updates, whatever changes were made, previous laws they might have put into effect. We need to know what those things are. So that's the function of the CBO, to keep track of all of that and provide that data in doing the budget resolution process. Because remember, the budget resolution process, the first phase does not go to the president. That's internal to Congress, that concurrent action between both sides to determine what are the baselines, where are we starting from. Before we actually start deciphering the president's budget, we need to know where we're starting from. Because there's so much things that goes on during the year, they need that starting point. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay. What is the purpose of the authorization law? Because that goes to the president for the president to sign. What is the purpose of it? Says we got 20 million in the authorization law. Do we have 20 million, really? What is the purpose of the authorization law? Anybody? The authorization law authorizes the programs, the category of things we are allowed to do. So do I really have 20 million in the authorization law? No, I do not. That's just nice to have. Budget authority comes from the appropriation law, which also goes to the president. The authorization process, the appropriation process goes to the president to sign for it to become law. So the appropriation, if the appropriation comes back and it says we have 10 million for that program, when you mesh them together, we have 10 million. Does everyone understand the difference between the authorization law and the appropriation law? Okay, I don't hear any questions. What are the DoD related appropriations? 3 categories of appropriations. So there are 12 different appropriations that they vote on each year, but Department of Defense is responsible or have vested interest in 3 of them. So what are the 3 DoD appropriations act?
The defense, military construction, veterans affairs, energy, and water development.
Energy and water. So those are the 3. So whenever they're voting on the appropriations, we always listen out for when they approve the defense budget, when they approve the military construction / veterans affairs and the energy and water developments. All right. When Congress appropriates the funds, so after the president signs the appropriation, it becomes appropriation law. What are the 2 things that happens after Congress appropriates the funds? And I'll repeat this for every time I see you. The 2 things that happens once Congress appropriate the funds, on one side, the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant or the appropriation warrant. That's just notice that we have the law is in effect. Your account's been set up. Treasury warrant is issued. The second thing that happens on the administrative side is OMB begins the apportionment process. And how does that look? Once the appropriations have been approved, then the agencies, Department of Defense being one, submits an SF-132 document. I'm thinking 182 from schools, but the SF-132 document, which is an apportionment document, and the DoD says, all right, Congress appropriated 10 million for defense. Here's my SF-132 for my 10 million within 10 days from that appropriation law. And then OMB has how many days to submit the apportionment to the DoD, Department of Defense?
Within 30 days.
30 days.
Within 30 days. So again, 2 things happen when Congress appropriates the funds. The Treasury issues the Treasury warrant, and the OMB begins the apportionment process. The apportionment process, even though OMB begins it, they don't really do anything. The agencies submit the SF-132 apportionment document requesting their funding within 10 days. And then OMB has 30 days to submit or give them their apportionment. The SF-133 is an execution document that they have to submit quarterly, just like we do variance report or actual versus what we actually spend. They have to explain that. So that's done in SF-133. So Congress appropriates, OMB apportions. What do we get? What is the funding call that we get from the Department of Defense? Yeah, wake up on me. It's called an allotment. Appropriation, apportionment, allotment. And then we commit, obligate, and outlay when we take funds out of the Treasury to pay that bill. All right, so that's our recap for Yeah, for 1.1. So we're gonna go over 1.2 now. So I did that because it won't take that long to go through the manpower. So understand the function of the Department of Defense to provide forces to protect our security and also the security of our allies. That's the primary mission of defense. So because of that mission, then the resources are funded or provided accordingly. So even in manpower. So we're going to start on page, let me get my little glasses here. Page 125. So I'm just going to point out a few things in that paragraph. It tells you the mission of the Department of Defense, so you can read that again, to defend the Constitution, provide security, and also to our allies abroad. We have a Secretary of Defense, the SecDef, and under the Secretary of Defense, we have 3 military departments: Army, Navy, Air Force, and 20 defense agencies. So although we have 3 military departments, if you read further on, we have 5 armed services. So that's where they talk about the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, Space Force. That's a new one from the older study guides. So Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Space Force. When you read through that paragraph, it also talks about that combatant commander. So remember, the mission is to provide security. You use combatant commanders in all those NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, CENTCOM. Those are geographical areas where combatant commanders have operational control. So that's kind of going over the structure. And even in manpower, that's how they're resourced. The United States Coast Guard is also part of the armed forces, and it is aligned with Homeland Security. So the Coast Guard is not under the Department of Defense. That's what it's saying. The Coast Guard falls under Homeland Security. So that's the difference. If you get a list and it talks about Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Coast Guard, even though the Coast Guard is an armed force, it's not under Department of Defense. Any question on that paragraph? So you got a lot of pieces of information in that section alone. All right, the definition of manpower is on page 6, 126. So it's where we use defense. Manpower management as used in financial management refers to the processes of determining. We want to know, based on a mission, how many personnel, rank, structure, grade, how much budgetary resources, how much equipment is going to be needed for that, to hire that individual. So all of those things are considered. At the top of page 7, so what you're looking at manpower is which part of Department of Defense is responsible for manpower. You have the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, USDPNR. So you need to know that. Just like the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller is in charge of the money, when it comes to manpower, the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness is in charge of manpower. The first bullet on the page 7 says the first priority for programming manpower is the major combatant commands based on Joint Chiefs of Staff guidance. So a couple of things there I want to point out. So again, operational chain of command for the forces runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders when it comes to the Department of Defense. So the combatant commanders have priority for resources, for money, for people, for equipment. All right, so a key player here, Joint Chiefs of Staff. What is the function of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? and we have a chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So we have a senior chief of staff. What is the function? So remember, your president is a civilian, your secretary of defense is a civilian. So then tell me, what is the function of your chief of staff? Or the chairman? Well, those are your service representative, your Army folks. These are your uniform senior leaders. So they provide advice to your civilian secretary of defense, to your civilian president. So everything military related at the DoD level often goes through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that's where you hear the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff comes in, because he's an advisor on military matters. Does everyone understand the function of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff or the Joint Chiefs of Staff? Each service has a joint staff. Does everyone understand that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of things they say here. Let's see. Remaining forces are manned. They're straightforward. Civilian requirements are based on workload, planning factors. So I'm not going to read all that. Those are straightforward. Priority for resources goes to combatant commanders. On the chart on page 128, you have several terms there you can review, but I want to bring your attention to the Future Year Defense Program, because you're going to see that again within the study guide, FYDP. And let me see if they introduce it at all. You'll see it again, I think in module 2, in a better format. All right, so let me see if I can explain it. I'm going to read what it says first, then I'll try to help you there. The Future Year Defense Program is an official report or database that summarizes the resources provided at Department of Defense. The FYDP identifies funding for each appropriation, manpower, authorization, and program, and selected types of unit or equipment authorizations by resource management packages called program elements. What are they talking about? So understand that every mission that the Department of Defense conducts falls into, I think there are 12 force programs, 12 categories of mission. And within that, the FYDP has a list of the missions, and then it has all the funding associated with the mission, and whether it's done by the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. So the forces, the equipment, the appropriation associated with that program or that mission. And when they break down the funding, it's broken down into program elements. So that's the short version. FYDP, Future Year Defense Program. I think this is the only one I've seen the word database used. The DoD database that summarizes the programs, the appropriations, and the personnel in the services required to accomplish a DoD mission. So any question on FYDP, Future Year Defense Program? So this is kind of why I want you all to read the material before you come, so you'll be familiar with hearing the words. Then hopefully by the time I go over it, then it's clearer to you. All right, page 129 says mobilization and crisis issues. So there are certain things that happen in the world, whether it's locally or overseas, that we require additional personnel. So mobilization becomes an issue. How can we transition from a peacetime structure to a wartime structure, and the ability to provide filler or replacement personnel? So if you pull the military police off the gates, such as they did back in the day before Desert Storm and so forth, and then now we need personnel on the gates, how do we do that process? So that's part of mobilization or crisis, dealing with your crisis. Mobilization at the bottom, 1 to 9. During mobilization, defense leaders have to consider the current structure of the civilian workforce and its impact on mobilization. Because some of your civilian personnel may be in the reserve, so they get called up to go. How do we backfill them and so forth? A loss of civilian personnel who may be drafted into military service. Some people in uniform may have retired and they get called back. So those are all consideration in that mobilization process. So these are pretty straightforward. I don't see anything that stands out to say that it'll be difficult for you to understand. So I'm going to move on to page 11, unless anyone have any particular questions or issues with anything on those 2 pages. So we're looking at, think of the total force structure is what we're looking at. All right, page 11 says presidential authority to activate reserve forces. So typically, remember, if you go back to Article 1, Congress has the ability to declare war. So most of those functions fall under Article 1 of the Constitution. But with every law, there's always exception to the policy. So this is an exception where the power is now placed in the hands of the president to call up forces. And there's certain conditions that I need to point out in that first paragraph. So it says Title 10 U.S. Code 12304 gives the president authority. So the Title 10 tells you that it's dealing with active forces or reserve forces. What is the title that governs our National Guard? Does anyone know? There's 3 titles we kind of deal with in this process. So Title 10 is the most for the active and the reserve. What is the title for National Guard personnel? Does anyone know? Okay, so that's Title 32. What about civilian? DA civilian, Army civilian, Navy civilian? What title are we governed under?
5.
Title 5. So if nothing else, you should know Title 10, Title 32, and Title 5. All right, so let's take it back to the first bullet. So the president can call up reserve forces, active duty, selective reserve, and ready reserves. What are the conditions? It has to be a condition where it's an operational mission involving threat of terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, or an actual terrorist attack. The president can activate reserve forces. What else? All right, let's see. The president may authorize the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Security for the Coast Guard, remember Coast Guard under Homeland, without the consent of Congress to order to active duty. And it's not for regular training, this is an emergency for not more than how long? A year, right? 365 days. So we got a couple of information from that one. The president under Title 10, and it should be easy to remember, U.S. Code 12304. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4. Title 10. President can activate forces if you're dealing with weapons of mass destruction, is the emergency, terrorist attack, or a threat of a terrorist attack. The Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security can call up forces no more than 365 days from any unit of the selective reserve, any member of the individual ready reserve. The second condition, the total amount of selective reserve that he may call up is 200,000. Of which not more than 30,000 may be in the IRR, individual ready reserve. So the total amount is 200,000. And of that 200,000, no more than 30,000 can be from the IRR. Does everyone get that? So we have several things going on in that for the presidential authority to activate reserve forces. So 200,000 and 30,000 in the IRR, no more than a year without going to Congress. So any other instances, they got to go to Congress. Congress got to approve for you to send forces to go whatever that emergency is. You got some definitions on page 12, whether it's whatever that position that civilian is in, emergency, essential, crisis situation. Those individuals that are hired typically know if something happens, okay, your position, you will deploy, or your emergency essential, meaning you'll come to work when everybody else stays home. So make sure you review the different types of civilian employees. What you need to focus on the bottom of page 13 is how to calculate such things as know the definition, the terms and the definition, but the specific ones, turnover rate. So by knowing the definition, the number of employees who left divided by the total number of positions, fill rate, lapse rate. So focusing on those, making sure that you understand the definition and you understand how to calculate those. Because none of the formulas are ever given to you on the exam. Those are things you have to know. It might just ask you, what is the turnover rate? After they give you the data, they might just ask you a question. All right, so if we want to separate individuals in the Department of Defense, we have two alternatives on page 14. They can either do the volunteer for early retirement. We retire the individuals early, or we can offer a separation buyout. We can buy them out. But there's some restrictions. So you have VSIP for the separation incentive and VERA, Voluntary Early Retirement Authority. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The fifth paragraph down says the Department of Defense is permitted no more than 25,000 buyout separations a year. So that's the restriction. And it's not including if you have to downsize because of base realignment. You're closing a base and then people are offered money to leave. That is not included in the 25,000. And then buyout payments, the lesser of 40,000 and the individual severance pay. So that tells me if my severance pay is 20,000, I'm going to get 20,000. The highest it's going to go for these buyout is the highest you can get is 40,000. So I'm guessing if your severance pay is 50,000, you're only going to get 40,000. That's how I interpret that. And an employee, if you accept a buyout to leave the Department of Defense, the individual cannot be reemployed for 12 months after receiving the incentive pay unless you have an exception to policy. And then, and the one with the 40,000 or severance pay also says that if the employee comes back on board, the individual must be fully repaid if the employee rejoins within 5 years of separation. So if you take the 40,000, you still got to pay that money back if you come back on board within 5 years. You got to pay that 40,000 back. Well, you're not going to get 40 because of taxes, right? All right, any question thus far about anything I've covered so far? All right, so what we're going to look at now, the focus is going to be on how do we offset if we don't have enough DA civilians positions, how do we offset our personnel requirements? So now we're going to go into functions that we use contractors to do. So Inventory Reform Act of 1998 talks about the annual list of government activities not inherently governmental. Inherently governmental are those functions that can only be done by a government employee. So,
Miss Helen, I got a question about that.
yes, ma'am. Uh-huh.
Is there ever a case of where there's an exception to policy on that you've ran across? I have, and without going in, you know what I do. So I have seen it, and I always kind of raised an eyebrow to it because it was a contractor, but the problem was they couldn't get a government person there to do the job.
Right. So that command, just assume the risk
Okay,
is
Okay.
basically what end up happening if you can't hire some government employee. Because like you say, certain things, like I think it mentions the place where they make the money. It's usually government. The jail houses, Leavenworth,
okay,
are
okay.
usually inherently governmental personnel. So when you
Okay.
go outside of those legal restrictions, then you're assuming the risk.
Right, okay, that makes sense. Okay,
Yeah. Because I
Thank you.
think, because on page 17, it talks about the types of activity, whether it's a commercial activity versus inherently governmental activity. And then they give some examples later on. So a commercial activity is in a process resulting in a product or services that could be obtained from the private sector, right? It's something that we can get from the private sector. An inherently governmental activity is mandated, often that you have to use a federal employee. So this position would not be in competition with commercial sources. I want to point out on 17, if you notice OMB Circular A76, and I think I failed to do it in the first section. We talked about OMB Circular A11. So Office of Management and Budget, when you receive guidance from OMB, is often published in a circular. So OMB Circular A11 deals with the budget process. If you go back in 1.1, you'll see OMB Circular A11 mentioned quite frequently there. When you're talking about commercial activities or those functions, you find it in OMB Circular A76. All right, inherently governmental functions fall into two categories: the act of governing and monetary, I think this is where I saw it, transactions. So examples, I like examples when you deal with the courts, right? Investigation, your CID, Criminal Investigations Division, prosecutions, your military personnel is the ones that typically perform those functions. The monetary side, tax collection and revenue disbursement, control of the treasury account. You want a government individual in charge of that. So on the bottom of page 17, you have some examples of some functions that are inherently governmental functions. On page 19, on the OMB Circular A76 in more detail, that is the OMB policy regarding using contractors. So it is the 76 OMB Circular A76 is designed to empower federal managers to make justifiable business decisions. For three things: balance the interests of the parties to make or buy cost comparison, provide level playing field, because we want to make sure we have the right people backfilling whoever we pull out, and then encourage competition and choice. So if it's a function that is not inherently governmental, we can have a contract in place. On page 21, 1 to 21, you have a list of terms. So let me explain. Conversion to contract, you can understand, it's straightforward. Conversion to in-house is if we have a contractor that was doing the job and then we convert that position or that function back to the government. Commercial source, cost comparison, and the last one, performance work statement. So the one I want to point out to you, because it's not a familiar term, is the most efficient organization.
Thank you.
So you have a vendor or a contractor who could do the commercial function, And then if it's a government structure, then it's called the MEO, the most efficient organization. What am I talking about? Okay, let's go to page 22. So if you can see that diagram. So let's say they want to do a cost competition process. Oftentimes you have to, in the middle of that diagram on the top left, you have to notify Congress. And I'll look at a couple pages in the future, you'll see the reasons you'll go to Congress. So it says the first and the next to last step, Congress must be notified. You do a request for study contract on the left. Then you are awarded a study contract to determine, okay, which direction to go. And if you note at the start of the study, you either develop the MEO, that's the government structure to do the job, or you have a performance work statement. That's what we're going to send out for bids for contractors to do the job. So have anyone been involved in a manpower study? If you've been around the government long enough, you should have at least had one experience. Has anyone been involved in a manpower study? Would like to share? Okay, I don't hear. You have?
Yeah. If they were trying to determine, this was some time back, for people that don't know, I'm GFIBS, or formerly GFIBS on-site support. And someone at the command that I was working for had thought maybe that we were being paid too much to do the job to support the civilian and or military workforce. And it was pretty much, I had to gather the information to give to leadership. Okay, this is what my role is. This is what my interactions are with the civilian and military workforce. And what they're essentially looking for was to try to bring in another company that would actually coming in at a lower bid.
Mhm.
And as it turned out, after some months had passed, they did go with the lower bid company. However, the company I worked for at that time, they kept us on board, and the command could only ask if we trained the people that they were essentially hiring to replace us.
Mhm.
Yeah,
No.
to replace us.
And then you train them.
Yeah, and then we had to train them. And of course, none of us said yes, we would do that. But if they were being hired to come in and to replace us, essentially, they should have had the same level of experience, if not more. And a year after that, because this actually all took place over the course of 24 months, some internal things happened, and then the lower bid contracting firm was actually kicked off post.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's on the
always-
contractor
I've
side.
spent
So
most
thank you
of
for
my
sharing
time-
that.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
spent a lot of my time with arson. So, you
Okay.
know, you're used to seeing stuff like that.
Okay. And then even from the government side, what I've been
Yeah.
involved, like I was an instructor in uniform, and you know, whenever they come to you and they say, okay, tell us exactly what you do
Yeah.
from the time you come in, of course,
Yeah.
minus the coffee breaks and all of that. So we have to detail the amount of hours it takes to process a document or whatever it is, because we were building that MEO structure to say it costs the government X amount of dollars to do this function. Then in the performance work statement, then the contractors who bid on it would then come in with their costs. And then if you look at the diagram on 22 again, you'll see at some point there's a cost comparison that's done to determine whether we stick with the MEO or we go to a contractor. And so the condition, and it's listed, I think, on page 20, let me see, 24, the last paragraph on page 24, most of the time, if under the streamline process, okay, not that one, cost comparison is done, the commercial side must be at least 10% lower than the government cost, is what they're looking for in most instances, to keep it in-house or for the contractor to take over. Now, understand that sometimes condition dictates, depending on what's going on in the country, they might go straight to a contractor. Because if for those who've been around a few years prior to Desert Storm, so prior to 1990, I guess, 1990, it used to strictly be military police on the gates, period. No civilians, no GS. And then once the wars kicked off, then all those military personnel had to leave. And so I think they immediately streamlined the process, which is what they're talking about in the bottom of 24, where you had, I think they started with contractors first, and they had contractors on the gate, and then eventually they transitioned to some GS positions on the guards. And so it depends on what's going on in the country. Oftentimes, if they have to streamline the process, but it says a standard competition is 12 months to 18 months, but it can be reduced up to 90 days. All right, so let's go to page 25, where it talks about the official announcements and notification. And I mentioned that Congress needs to be notified when you're talking about cutting positions, or just the potential to cut positions. You're not even doing it yet, because you're talking about moving money, and then you're into the field of what Congress does. So congressional notification, remember the first and the second to last step in that diagram. DoD components must notify Congress of the intention to do a cost comparison. So you're just doing the test, the study involving 46 or more DoD civilians. So that's your trigger word there. Congress is notified if the study is going to involve 46 or more civilian personnel. The DoD component notifies the USD for personnel and readiness, Under Secretary of Defense, because they're in charge of personnel, of any such intent at least 5 working days before they notify Congress, which makes sense, right? DoD wants to know before you're going to tell Congress that you're doing this study. The cost comparison process begins on the date of congressional notification. DoD employee notification. DoD components shall consult with DoD civilian employees who will be affected. You got to tell the employees, just like all of us in that exam or that test, that our study that was being done at the time when mine was being done, is we knew what they were doing. So we just had to participate. We knew, even the civilian side, they knew of the potential of that position going to a contractor versus government employees. Any question on anything so far? So that's straightforward. So all of that is A76, OMB Circular A76 deals with commercial activity. I'm just repeating that. All right, so page 26 kind of switches gears on you. So this is kind of some of the things you'll learn in fiscal law also here in manpower management. Ethics. What are some of the ethical things we can and cannot do? So I'm going to point a few of those out. And most of it deals with gifts. So on page 27, gifts from outside sources. So oftentimes we interact with contractors. They either bring us supplies, they give us a product because we pay for it. But there's some of them who give you gifts. And now you need to know, what can you accept legally without them expecting anything, any favors? So where the value of the gift is $20 or less, not to exceed $50 annually. So it doesn't say fiscal year. Meaning if a contractor gives me a pen, that pen, the value of the pen must be less than $20. If that same contractor comes back within that same year and they want to give me a cup and the cup is $50, I cannot accept it, because if I put that 50 and that 20 together, then it's over the total of that $50 that I can accept legally. If you do anything outside of that, then you're in that gray area. You're on your own area. All right, so gifts, yes, you can accept gifts from contractors if the value of the gift is $20 or less and a one-time. And also, if you receive a second gift, the total value must not exceed $50 annually. Any question on gifts? You can read through the other ones as far as relationship with people. You might have a relationship with someone based on because you grew up together, your family, and so forth. So you can accept gifts. There are different exceptions, but I wanted to point that one out. Page 28 also talks about gifts between employees. And if you read through it, the following individual gifts to a supervisor. So a subordinate to a supervisor, there's a $10 limit. So if people are coming around and say, hey, General so-and-so is leaving, or the deputy or the director's leaving, would you like to donate? You are limited legally to $10 or less. They cannot extort any more out of you legally. If you just decide you want to give more, that's on you, but understand ethically, you want to limit it to $10. Food and refreshments. If you're bringing food, what they're telling you here is you need to share it among the people in the office. Don't just bring something special for that one person, your supervisor. You keep bringing that supervisor refreshments and nobody else gets to partake, then you open up that ethical question of, okay, what's going on? So you don't want any issues. You want to make sure that whatever you bring is offered to everyone else. Any question on these ethical guidelines? All right, conflict, financial interest. If you have a conflict of interest, if you're interacting with someone and whether it's directly in your position, if you're interacting with someone and you have some questions in whether you can then deal with them on a different topic, just don't have that conflict of interest. Just kind of break it, or go to your ethical lawyers to document that you have a relationship with this individual. The most of these are straightforward. Let's go to page 31, where it talks about seeking other employment. So you work for the Department of Defense, you want to leave the Department of Defense and go work somewhere else. We're going to look at that. But for this particular one, seeking other employment, if you're a senior person, executive branch employees, which is what we are, may not participate in any particular government matter that will affect the financial interests of a person or entity seeking employment. So they give you definition: no longer seeking employment, misuse of position, outside activities, what you do outside of your day-to-day, make sure it doesn't overlap, or anything you're doing that you do personally will impact your profession. What I want to focus in on page 33 is honoraria. Honoraria is basically saying, I graduated from, let's say, the University of, let's say, Webster University, since I have a master's with them. And Webster University invites me to come to speak to their graduating class because I'm an alumni. And they offer to pay my travel. They offer to pay me for it. Can I accept that payment? Can I accept money, compensation, to go speak at Webster University?
No, you cannot.
Why not? Or can I?
Wait a minute.
I would tell you, if you look up honoraria, yes, I can. You cannot if they're inviting me, if they're just inviting me as Helen Thomas, a graduate of
That's
Webster
okay.
University.
Okay. I
If
got
they're
it.
inviting me, Helen Thomas, because I work for the Reserve Command and am in the Army, and it start listing your official position, everything you do. And in your bio, it talks about all your government functions. So kind of like in our business, it's what you say in the document. Is if you're invited because of your, I would say your professional position, then you cannot, you can't get paid twice.
Right. Okay.
And for instance, I have the perfect example. I do the CDFM study group. I often have contractors who reach out to me. They're like, hey, can you come and teach my folks? We'll pay you. So trust me, years ago, I already went to legal, and they was like, no, you can't take money. You can't work for the government, get paid. And again, you're going your official capacity, because I'm dual hat. If I was not working for the government, yes, I could, but I cannot accept payment. Free and clear, because once you accept it from one contractor, then you open up the doors for more issues. So the bottom line with honoraria, compensation may be restricted, and it tells you on the 5 U.S. code, but it says, however, on February 22nd, the U.S. Supreme Court decided United States versus National Treasury employees, affirming a court appeals decision and joining enforcement of the honoraria prohibition against federal employees below grades GS 16. The ban still may be enforceable against federal employees in grades GS 16 or above, and those paid on their other schedule. But the bottom line is continue to apply to all DoD employees, including a prohibition on receiving compensation for teaching, speaking, and writing that relates to their official duties. So it's kind of like one of those, like, read between the lines position. All right, next we have post-employment. This is the one I was talking about earlier. Is you want to leave the Department of Defense, you've been working with a contractor while you were in uniform, you're a DA civilian, and now you want to go work for that civilian side. What does it say legally or ethically? Executive branch employees are subject to certain restrictions. So if the employee's involvement in such a matter was personal, then the employee is permanently banned from representing anyone on the same matter to any federal department agency. That means you was working with the company, you can't know, because you know the ins and out of that government function. Now you want to work for the company so you can know the inside, like insider information. And certain high-level officials are subject to a cool-off period for a period of 1 year after serving in a senior position. The official may not make any appearance on behalf of any person other than the United States before his former agency with intent to influence. So you got a 1 year cooling off period for high officials. What else? Employees who participated personally and substantially in ongoing trade or treaty negotiation and had access to certain information subject to a 1 year restriction after they leave government service. So most of these are that 1 year cooling off period. Again, especially if you deal with contract and contractors on a day-to-day basis with the government, they typically don't want you to leave the government and then go on the offense. Now you know some of the inside information. So they give you that time frame to kind of cool off, and processes should have changed by then and so forth. So post-employment. All right, so I think that is all. Everything else is pretty straightforward. So that's your manpower management. Let me see something here. And then, any question of me on anything I've covered today? Exception, outside, what kind of activities? All right, I don't hear any questions. All right, I'll stand by for a few minutes. If you have not already subscribed to our YouTube page, please go ahead and do so to provide more visibility on the YouTube platform for others who are studying to take the CDFM. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you guys again next time.
Thank you, Miss Helen.
You're welcome.
I have
Thank
to
you
get
so
back
much.
to work now because everybody's pinging me.